Hi everyone, my name's Amrit Swali and I'm a research associate in Chatham House's International Security Programme and the co-chair for Gender on Chatham House's EDI working group. I have the really fun job of chairing this short talk on integrating gender and inclusion into cyber capacity building. We've only got 30 minutes, so it's quite quick. So before we get started, some very quick housekeeping rules. So we're on the record. We've got people tuning in online and in person, so if you have a question, and you're in the room, please put your hand up and wait for a roving microphone. And if you're online, please use the Q&A function and we'll get to that towards the end of the session. So as we've all kind of heard and seen throughout this morning, cyber capacity building isn't straightforward and it's not easy either. Its design and its implementation are often subject to a whole load of factors that replicate some of the offline world's very unsavory characteristics. And this is particularly seen with gender. So in cyberspace, women and people who are non-binary, trans or gender non-conforming are disproportionately victims of violence and discrimination online. So it's clearly a very big problem. Now, cyber capacity building obviously provides an opportunity to address these challenges, but it comes with even more challenges. So it's not an easy feat. And these challenges are particularly seen in the kind of social side of things. As we all know, capacity building is aimed at communities of people, so whether large or small. And these communities see gender and inclusion in different ways, and its integration into activities means different things and carries different weight. So it's a really complicated tapestry, and I've got three very cool speakers here to talk all about that. So we've got Faraz Hassan, who is the Head of Portfolio for Green Economies and Infrastructure at Social Development Direct. Dr. James Shires, who is a Senior Research Fellow in the International Security Programme at Chatham House, and Sarusha Govender, who is an Academy Fellow here at Chatham House too. So Faraz, if I could start with you. So at Social Development Direct, your team works on gender and social inclusion issues, particularly in infrastructure. And obviously, you've been doing some research into cyberspace. So I wanted to ask, when it comes to cyberspace and cyber capacity building, what are the issues that you're seeing? What are these gendered harms that exist, and why are they there?
Sure, thank you. So we've been doing some research for the DAP program on gendered harms and cyber harms in particular. So what we found is there's sort of two ways you can think about the cyber harms that we found. I should probably also start by saying it's quite an under-researched area. So there is a real lack of data and kind of practical evidence behind it. But, so from what we do know, there's cyber violence against women and girls is a particular issue, and that can be understood as an extension of offline violence against women and girls, which people will be familiar with, which is facilitated by technology online. So you have all kinds of harms which are targeted at women and girls in particular, and other excluded groups, and that can be things like cyberbullying, stalking, non-consensual sexual imagery shared online, doxing, targeted hacking, and so on. And you've probably heard about a lot of that kind of stuff from the news and from Twitter and social media and so on. So that's sort of one whole family of harms. And then there's the even more under-researched kind of harms, which we're hoping to look at more as part of DAP as well in this research, which are the gendered impacts of cyber attacks in general. So when cyber incidents happen or cyber attacks happen, they can impact people differently based on their identity, or not just gender, but all kinds of intersecting forms of identity. So things like data breaches or internet shutdowns can have more impact or specific harms on women compared to the general population. So that's the way. Those are kind of two groups that we're seeing of harms. And then there's certain things which characterize those harms as well. So firstly, there's sort of the prevalence. So again, data is patchy, but from data available, there's estimates saying that between 58 to 73% of women have experienced some kind of violence online. And there's other figures for different excluded groups. But generally, there's a real lack of data because it's a very hard thing to measure or to report on. So it's very prevalent. The second kind of feature is that there's and this is going to be very relevant to a lot of the conversations that have been happening this morning, that there's a continuum between offline harms and online harms. So they're very, very linked. So for example, women and girls who experience cyber abuse or harassment online are also very likely to be experiencing it offline. And there's gender dynamics to that. So, for example, women who experience intimate partner violence are also more likely to be experiencing some kind of harassment or violence online, or it could be stalking from ex-partners and so on. So there's a real continuum there, and it actually applies to all kinds of issues, and hopefully we can come back to that in a bit more detail. And then, then it's sort of like, okay, so why is it important, and what is the impact of that? So why does it matter that there's different kinds of harms based on gender or other forms of identity? So what we found in our research, there's impacts which span sort of personal impact, but also social, economic, and even democratic political impacts of those kind of harms. So, for example, that kind of online abuse and harassment can increase anxiety, stress, and in extreme cases it can lead to suicide and people becoming victims of suicide. At a social level, it can have social harms in terms of how it impacts women or excluded groups and how they use technology or the internet. If you think about economic harms, and I think this will be really relevant to a lot of the conversations today, the use of cyberspace is gendered, so women and excluded groups use cyberspace in different ways, whether that's how they access the internet or use devices, the level of digital literacy and so on. And there's been lots of evidence and studies by GSMA, for example, that online kind of fear of safety and security issues can drive people offline, so it can prevent them from wanting to use mobile phones or access the internet, particularly women and excluded groups. So you can imagine the economic cost of people not adopting technologies because of safety concerns. There are many countries where, in the absence of regular access to markets or economic opportunities, technology facilitates that. So, for example, in Indonesia, small businesses, women-owned small businesses account for 35% of online e-commerce compared to 15% of offline, something like that in terms of figures. So again, you can imagine if women are reliant on technology or access to internet for income and revenue, that if they're not being able to access or safely use those services, the economic impact that can have. And then, again, on the news, you might have heard all kinds of targeted attacks at women politicians or people with public profiles here in the UK, all over the world, in political ways or otherwise, or from trolling online. And there's evidence to show that can actually make women, it can inhibit their participation in political democratic processes. You would have heard of cases in the news of women being targeted with death threats and rape threats and fake imagery, deep fakes being released online to undermine those women, and that's been used as a political tool in lots of cases. So there's a whole host of sort of impacts, and understanding those are going to be important to designing responses.
Thank you, Faraz. Just wanted to ask, you spoke a lot about women and their experiences in cyberspace, but from your research, was there any indication of how that experience differs from that of men and boys? And also, is there anything specific that you can speak to about how people who are non-binary or gender non-conforming experience cyberspace and the kind of harms and impacts they experience?
Yeah, so these are all intersecting forms of exclusion. So someone has multiple identities, and each of those their sexual orientation, their gender, their religion, their ethnicity can all play a role in exclusion, and that can end up being multiple, so they can be laid on top of each other. Again, data is quite hard to come by in terms of how different groups are affected, but there are some studies which have shown on account of gender, on account of sexual orientation, what people feel comfortable saying online, or they might feel comfortable being able to say things online which they can't in the real world, and so on. So all of these are really important in understanding how people use technology and so on. And with men and boys, again, the evidence that is available shows that they're often less impacted in a lot of cases from certain kinds of cyber harm. So cyberbullying and harassment do affect men and boys as well as women, but the impact is different. In some cases, men and boys tend to sort of downplay or kind of minimize that, whereas the impact on girls can be very different. There's studies, for example, on the impact of Instagram and how that affects young girls and kind of bullying on the platform and so on, which is a very gendered kind of harm. So yeah, there's lack of data, but there are examples emerging.
Great, thank you. James, where does capacity building come into this? Like, what can capacity building as an activity and as a program, as a big initiative do to mitigate and decrease these gendered harms?
It's a crucial question, and it's probably one that is very live for most of our audience today at the capacity building conference. So I'll say that there are 3 different ways in which cybersecurity capacity building can have a positive impact from a gender perspective. The first and most simple way is that cybersecurity capacity building, whether targeted in particular gendered harms or not, is itself a good thing, right? As long as you have a human rights centered approach to cybersecurity capacity building, building the ability of states, private sector and civil society partners to identify and respond to cybersecurity threats, that reduces the harms by those threats to people of all genders, of all gender identities and expressions, as Faraz explained. So at the baseline, doing cybersecurity capacity building, whether targeted or not, should, as long as it has a human rights centered underpinning, raise the level of gender equality and reduce gendered harms wherever it's done. Now, the second point is that to go beyond that, cybersecurity capacity building does need to acknowledge that there are different gendered impacts from cybersecurity. And we can think about these in a couple of different ways. One, as Faraz mentioned, that people of different gender identities and expressions have different security needs, priorities, and vulnerabilities. Right? So different groups or different people with different identities will be exposed to certain kinds of harms more than others. Conducting an analysis of how these harms function online in cyberspace, what impacts they have, and the appropriate responses as part of a broader cybersecurity capacity building initiative is really crucial to ameliorate or prevent those harms. Now, the second part in which cybersecurity capacity building can adopt a gender perspective is to recognize not only that the harms or impacts that cybersecurity seeks to protect against are gendered, but also that our ideas of what security is and should be are also gendered, right? Who should do security? What should security look like? What is the appropriate place and type of conversation that is a cybersecurity conversation? Right? We know that cybersecurity draws a lot on very gender unequal fields such as STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and in some smaller industries, for example, in threat intelligence and other technology firms, there can be very gender unequal and very gender harmful workplace cultures and practices that are very exclusive of people of diverse gender identities and expressions. So thinking about what kind of security cybersecurity is meant to provide is just as important for having a gender mainstreamed cybersecurity capacity building as is focusing on specific gendered harms or impacts. And then finally, this brings us to the last point, is that once we have an understanding that a gendered focus on cybersecurity capacity building improves security for everyone, for people of all gender identities and expressions, then the next question is, well, how do we improve participation and gender inequality in the governance and implementation of that cybersecurity capacity building, right? These are not just targets or subjects of a particular program, but widespread involvement from the beginning of people of different gender identities, but also intersectionally from different minoritized groups, is really important to make sure that capacity building itself is as inclusive as possible, as well as delivering in particular communities, countries, or groups.
Thank you, James. big question. How would you do that? So how would you make how would you implement those 3 points in terms of with thinking about integrating gender and inclusion into projects and making sure it's there from the start? What kind of things should we be focusing on? Is it a case of resources? Is it a case of financial availability? Or is there an element of trying to convince people that it's the right thing to do? Because of course, this is something that we discuss a lot, that when we talk about gender in cyberspace, we either talk about A, improving participation, which was your third point, or B, looking at the harms and how we reduce harms. But how do we go beyond that to actually make sure that this is a very streamlined approach and that we do, as you say, mainstream gender and inclusion?
And the answer is always going to be multiple, right? There's not one silver bullet that every capacity building program can do. But to start from the different 3 ways, the first point is to make sure there is a strong human rights center to any cybersecurity capacity building program, right? Whether these are rights focused on privacy and data protection laws, right, which we've discussed a lot today, whether these are rights focused around cybercrime laws and the rights of both those accused and the victims of cybercrime, protecting those people. The human rights framework that includes gender equality as a UN-recognized right is the starting point for including gender. So that's a starting point. After that, you then need to include a gender analysis throughout any capacity building program. Right? It can never be enough to retroactively look at a program, its impacts and its outcomes, and say, well, how can we change that? How can we improve that from a gender perspective? It needs to be included by design. Right? We talk very regularly about security by design in the cybersecurity industry, but having gendered security by design is the next logical step, and that's what you need to have for cybersecurity capacity building. Then in terms of participation, yes, the industry participation is a crucial point, participation in the cybersecurity industry, but here it's about participation in governance, in decisions about capacity building allocation. That's frankly a question of resource, right? What is spent where, by whom, and for whom, but also in decision making, right? Capacity building programs often make a really central point out of their inclusion of a variety of stakeholders, right? They bring in different state agencies, they bring in the private sector, and they bring in civil society, right? And these myriad stakeholders themselves, how diverse are they from a gendered point of view? So that participation in both the governance and decision making on cybersecurity capacity building from a gender perspective is as important in the practices and the implementation.
Thank you, James. Sarusha, so your research focuses very specifically on the metaverse, so a new area of cyberspace. Now, it's no doubt going to recreate some of the gendered harms and problems that both James and Faraz have spoken about. But what are the specific issues that we should be looking out for, both in the metaverse, but also more broadly in terms of when we think about new and emerging media platforms and forms of technology? Are these issues and problems going to be replicated, or are they going to look slightly different?
Thanks, Amrit. So the metaverse is this new buzzword that is sort of the next version of cyberspace, but really it's its own special thing because the metaverse takes a lot of those elements of cyberspace and takes them forward, but also brings a lot of our real life into what will be the next iteration of the internet. So that means that whereas the internet is a static thing now, so something that happens on the internet, you can deal with it retroactively in terms of policy if there's gendered harms. When it comes to the metaverse, it's all happening live. It's all a big undecided world with various incarnations where we've already seen, even though it's in its infancy, that a lot of gendered harms have been imported into the internet and they come from real life. And we've seen women being virtually attacked in the metaverse space. We've seen women being stalked, data being disclosed. All of those harms that we see in the cyberspace world are already coming into the metaverse space. But the problem is that the metaverse is not just, as I said, the static space, and it depends on how we use the metaverse. There's a VR element to the metaverse, the virtual reality element to it. So you create a virtual version of yourself and you exist in the metaverse as a person in the metaverse. So when you do that, it's a live version. Things that happen to you in the real world can happen to you in the metaverse. If there are no policies or policing or some way to protect yourself in that space, we can see a lot of harms happening, and we already have seen the beginnings of that in terms of Meta's, virtual concerts and areas where lots of people congregate in this virtual space. We've seen a lot of people a lot of women particularly being attacked. And a very interesting aspect is that we have a lot of children in this space as well, because you can't really tell who you're interacting with in the metaverse. We create virtual avatars of ourselves and we are online, but there's no one policing the age of these avatars. Their access points, what they're sort of doing and who they're interacting with. So we've seen cases of young girls being groomed in the metaverse already, even though it's this tiny technology in its infancy and it's going to grow rapidly in the coming years. It's already sort of a $6.8 trillion industry with millions of users online. So these people need sort of protections in this space. And currently, the policies are leaving it up to the big tech industries who create these spaces to sort of police how people act and how they are treated in these sort of spaces. And that hasn't been sort of a good way to go so far. Now, if we look at the VR aspect, there's also the AR aspect, the augmented reality and the mixed reality aspect of how you sort of interact with the metaverse. That means that there's going to constantly be a version of digital information layered on the world as we know it now, which means we'll never be able to unplug from the metaverse. Like you're able to switch off your computer now and say, I've had enough of this gendered abuse on the internet, I'm done. With a digital layer of information layered across the world now, you can never switch that off. What that means is that there's information about you constantly out in the world now. Information you've revealed on social media, but also information you haven't revealed. And when third parties can sort of add that information to your digital profile online, and people can view that through a lens, through a cell phone screen, through any sort of digital interface. That means you don't know what information you're sharing. And when we think sort of a Black Mirror sort of approach, that's sometime in the future, that's happening right now. You can sort of look at London as sort of a place with a lot of QR codes or digital information access points. And if you walk through the city, you'll see little tags that show you how to hold your phone up and access digital information. In a lot of cases, that's benign. It's art installation. It's sort of telling you how to access things in the city. But in some cases, it's information about the people who are in that space. And you have no idea what sort of information is being shared. And when we talk about digital harms, this is attached to women and girls and LGBTQ groups and minorities more specifically, because that is used to sort of, enable gendered harms against them, and they're targeted usually first in that. And there's not enough protections in place yet to protect them.
How do you think tech companies can be incentivized to make these spaces safer? Is that something that is the onus entirely on them, or is there a good case to be made for a kind of multi-stakeholder approach, as James suggested, and how would that work, do you think, in practice?
Well, multi-stakeholder approach is absolutely necessary, but accessing the metaverse is not just brand new now. Some of us who've been using the space have been using it for decades, and what we've seen is a top-down and a bottom-up approach is the best way to sort of use it. The users use the metaverse through the tech. If they say we're not going to use a specific form of tech because there's too many gendered harms, and we're going to go to another form of tech that actually enables more protections for us, that is a great way to incentivize big tech because they follow the money. And we've already seen that happening with, especially with digital concerts being one of the biggest growing areas in the VR space. We've seen people being attacked or women being attacked virtually in that area. And people saying, we're not going to use that space, we're going to use another one that enables better protections for us. And then not just the users, but the people who are enabling those multi-million-dollar concerts in that space will move to a different tech space. So there's that approach. And then there's also the sort of thing we don't get into with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and that entire industry, which has a lot of women at the top as creators, as people who have an active voice deciding how the tech is used and why. And when they see these gendered harms being perpetrated, they are often the ones to ask for change first and make sure the money is going in a different direction. So it's bringing in all those voices who know how to, how to motivate tech to make better decisions, and making sure they're incorporated into a more policy-based decision that makes it a safer environment for more people.
We'll turn to the audience for some questions, but just very quickly to James and Faraz, a similar question. How would you incentivize capacity builders to consider gender and inclusion elements into their work? James, do you want to start?
I can go. I guess there's two questions here. One is incentivize and the other is require. If you want to incentivize, then the way forward is to show that including gender elements from the start is the only way to actually achieve good gender outcomes at the end of a capacity building project. And then at a broader level, you incentivize by demonstrating that better gendered cybersecurity leads to better cybersecurity for everyone. Right, so this is, it should be a central part of a capacity building mission to include it at the start. It's within the incentives of doing capacity building to start with. But on the more sort of concrete side, right, you could require organizations that capacity building organizations are working with to conduct gender analysis, to, for example, collect gender disaggregated data. Right, this is a very important point, and obviously the privacy protections around that data are equally important. But unless you have gender and sex disaggregated data, you can't conduct an analysis of gendered impacts of certain policies. So that would be a kind of requirement for participation in certain projects that you could introduce.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that exactly. I think it's not just about, like you were saying earlier, it's not just the right thing to do. It's actually imperative to deliver sustainable programs. And it's also not just there's kind of the rights-based argument, but I would go as far as to say there's even a business case argument for integrating gender or an exclusion kind of lens into the design of programs. It's not just that actually it's good for those people who are involved or who are protected from harms. It's better for everyone. Like I said, there's so many economic impacts, social impacts, political impacts, which aren't just confined to the people who are being harmed, but actually inhibit, the effectiveness of access programs. So, that's partially the reason for the digital access program and these pillars. It's you're bringing people online, but you have to enable them to actually use those digital services or connectivity. So I think that's the key part of the incentive. It's not just going and being like, hey, you should think about this. It's the right thing to do. And also, I'd say you're already doing it. So even a lot of the things talked about this morning, you can pick out lots of examples. So in the talk that we had this morning, the repeated point about education being really important in digital literacy. Digital literacy in education is gendered. So the level of digital literacy, there's a big gender gap and disparity there. So if you're designing programs, but you're thinking about your average male user, and that's the center, and that's your default, you're actually not designing for half your target audience for that program or half your stakeholders. So you're already anytime you're dealing with anything that's to do with people, you're already designing these programs. So it's also not necessarily an added cost either, because you are going to develop a strategy or you are going to develop interventions. It's about how you shape those actions that you're going to do anyway to be responsive to social issues and gender.
Great, thank you. We're almost running over, so if there are any questions from the audience, we can take them very quickly. Yes, the lady at the front.
Thank you. So really, really interesting. I just have one question. You mentioned a bit of research on the gender and inclusion. Within these research, is there any recommendation, like the one you mentioned just now, how we can integrate better into the design phase of a new program, or how that can be kind of taken forward? Just asking because we had a lot of challenges, and being the first is, if you ask in this room what cyber harm or like gender harm is, you will have like, I don't know how many different answers. So it is really difficult going into another country and understanding the culture and kind of what that can mean for them. So having like a bit of kind of tips and recommendation how to bring this forward into the design phase would be great. Thank you.
Anyone else with a question? I'm going to take that as a no. Great. Faraz, do you want to start off?
Sure.
that?
So we're still working on the recommendations, but yes, I think to give you a flavour of a few, I mean, we're still, as I said, we're still thinking through it. Just going back to that point I said around it being very linked to offline kind of harm and experience. So if you're trying to address cyber harms aimed at particular groups, there needs to be a recognition that the root causes are not necessarily a cyber issue, and it goes kind of beyond that. It's much more fundamental. So, causes of gender-based violence in general, and the kind of responses used by programs, even by FCDO and others who are already working on those kind of harms in an offline environment, will have lessons learned that can be applied as part of the cybersecurity program. It needs to be alignment with those kind of initiatives. In terms of how you integrate it into a program, and you raised the very important point about context and context specificity, I think that's considered good practice in cybersecurity anyway, to have that kind of grassroots or local kind of understanding. And even from a gender and social inclusion perspective, the first thing you do is, have a gender analysis or a social analysis as part of any project as a starting point, the disaggregated data that you mentioned, so that you're actually informed in the decision making. And then there's actions all the way through a project cycle that you can do in terms of implementation and how you monitor and evaluate the impact from a gender and other social exclusion perspective. So there are actions you can integrate across the cycle. I would say that the bit that's kind of relatively new is like how you combine that with cybersecurity kind of technology or technical responses. And I'd say that's a really interesting area to explore and understand a bit more. But yeah, the research will aim to kind of give some ideas on that.
Brilliant. James or Suresh, did you want to respond at all?
Sure. Just as a final comment, I think one important thing to bear in mind with talking about the safety of this brand new technology and any emerging technology is the capacity building aspect is very, very important. And I think it's important looking at the metaverse now is that we see a lot of women already on this platform. A lot of women are active in building it and vocalizing how it should be used in the future. And I think we need to be very protective of keeping those women in the space. So gendered harms and attacks and policies that are not in place to protect them, or big tech not incentivized to keep women on the platforms, all very harmful to the future of what this could be. The metaverse could be an immense good. It could do immense good for democratizing. We've already seen it in education and telemedicine, but it's not going to be able to do that if we keep driving women off the platform. So digital education and getting people to know how to use it responsibly is important, but also making sure we just don't drive women and minorities off this very big emerging platform.
Great, brilliant. Well, we have run a little over. But it was an interesting conversation, so hopefully you guys are all okay with that. Thank you to Faraz, James and Suresh for a really interesting conversation, and thank you all for choosing this optional short talk. Not that it's a competition. I shouldn't have said that. Anyway, so we should have kicked off the second part of the workshops 5 minutes ago, so hopefully they won't have started without you. But if you are in workshop 1, please head back to the Astor room, and if you are in workshop 2, please head to the simulation center. And thank you all again for attending.